Hello and welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun Cho. Senior diplomats from the U.S., South Korea, and Japan met in Washington and vowed to strengthen coordination against North Korea's nuclear and missile threat. They also agreed to push back on Chinese behavior that challenges the rules-based international order. Today, we discuss the U.S. strategy in the region and coordination with its Asian allies.
Standing united, our nations will deter the DPRK and urge it to give up its nuclear weapons program.
We committed ourselves to respond firmly to any North Korean provocation and work toward complete denuclearization of North Korea.
We also shared the view that it is important to maintain peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait.
In the studio with me, Ambassador James Jeffrey, chair of the Middle East program at the Wilson Center. Ambassador Jeffrey was the special representative for Syria engagement and the special envoy for global coalition to defeat ISIS. Ambassador Jeffrey also served as the deputy national security advisor and the U.S. ambassador to Iraq, Turkey, and to Albania. Also joining us, Mr. Frederick Fleitz, Vice Chair of the Center for American Security at the America First Policy Institute. Mr. Fleitz was the National Security Council Chief of Staff during the Trump administration. Mr. Fleitz was also a CIA intelligence analyst covering WMD proliferation. Welcome to the program.
Good to be here.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador Jeffrey, Deputy Secretary Sherman, when she met with deputy foreign ministers from South Korea and Japan, she said that she doesn't think anybody can find a stronger trilateral cooperation than those three countries have. Now, United States won cooperation among U.S., South Korea, and Japan, and Japan and South Korea are taking the common approach despite their differences over history issues. Now, why do you think South Korea should look to the future and not the past?
First of all, thank you for having me on, John. I think it's very important because all of us are facing, be it Japan, the United States, Europe, or South Korea, a set of threats to the underlying international order that we have all come to learn, and in the case of both the United States, Japan, and Korea, or all three, prosper from 1945, despite wars and other things. And this is now under pressure from a set of countries which include China, Russia, and of course, North Korea. And thus, they have common perception of the overall threat, and they have a huge interest in maintaining this global order. But, and as we saw in the actual statements issued by the three, the tone is a little bit different, the priorities are different, and that's okay. And I think that what Wendy Sherman is showing is we're all right with a more targeted focus on the part of North Korea by South Korea, on the part of China by Japan, but you're all in the mix together with us, and we'll deal with this. This is a huge improvement from when we were trying to do this back 15 years ago in the Bush administration.
Now, Mr. Fleitz, as Ambassador Jeffrey just mentioned, there was a difference in the tone, and the press conference was another opportunity to find Japan being more forward-leaning in calling out China's assertiveness as opposed to South Korea. Now, within the U.S. government, you were most recently with the Trump White House. Is there a sense that Japan is aligning more closer with the United States and South Korea is less? And how should South Korea more actively align with U.S. approach to China, especially in the wake of the Chinese spy balloon incident?
Well, it's an honor to be here and to be with Ambassador Jeffrey. I think China was counting on South Korea being the weak link in this trilateral relationship. But I think President Yoon is proving that that's not going to be the case. And the reason is they're seeing actions by China that seems to be helping North Korea's nuclear program. For example, last year, China and Russia vetoed a key resolution. The first time since the 1980s, a resolution on North Korea was vetoed in the Security Council on North Korea's missile launches. We saw a recent missile parade with many mobile launchers that apparently were constructed with parts from China. Unless North Korea suddenly acquired the capability to build these vehicles, probably this is because of China. And I think Yoon is making a decision that if the U.S. is not going to engage North Korea as toughly as the Trump administration did, and if China is going to be at least looking the other way, if not assisting North Korea's nuclear programs, South Korea will be in the fight with Japan. I think that's where this is going.
Now, Mr. Fleitz, while you were in the Trump White House, and this was when it was President Moon Jae-in of South Korea, was South Korea considered the weak link out of the trilateral coordination?
Well, I think South Korea was a problem under President Moon. I like President Moon, and I know my old boss, John Bolton, did. But he really believed in the sunshine policy. He believed in diplomacy, and certainly he can be commended for that. But I think sometimes pressure had to be put on him to realize that a tough approach had to be taken to North Korea. And to his credit, he did work very productively with President Trump. I don't want to say he was a weak link. I will say he was much less interested in the aggressive approach of the Trump administration.
Ambassador Jeffrey, Japan has recently announced plans to build up its military, and if South Korea continues to hesitate in actively participating in U.S. strategy to push back against Chinese assertiveness, then would the United States naturally rely more on Japan and support more strongly Japan's military buildup?
It's not a dating relationship. It's not that you spend more time with X and thus less time with Y. I think the United States is committed to an enhanced relationship with Japan, but also bilaterally with Korea, but also in this new trilateral formulation, which again is a huge step forward from the frictions that I experienced between Korea and South Korea and Japan in the late 2007, 2008. Notice that we have trilateral military exercises last year for the first time since 2017. This is an indication that South Korea realizes it has to be part of the mix. But of course, given its priority to North Korea and given its very deep trade relations with China, it's not going to be in the same position as China is. Its primary threat is North Korea. Japan's primary threat is China. Just like India, we turned a blind eye to India's buying Russian oil because we know that India is a hugely important ally vis-a-vis China. The United States is capable of dealing at this sophisticated level. I don't think there is any problem at all between the three on this issue.
So you're saying U.S. policymakers are sensitive and understands the unique situation that South Korea is in?
Absolutely. And again, the Yoon government has shown much more flexibility and much more understanding of the U.S. position and the Japanese position towards China, which is why they went along with the joint statement and the joint meeting, even if there was a little difference in the priorities that each country gave.
Now, Mr. Fleitz, Deputy Secretary Sherman and her counterparts from South Korea and Japan reaffirmed the goal of denuclearizing the Korean peninsula. Is there a single person in the U.S. government who believes denuclearization of the Korean peninsula is feasible?
Well, certainly it's fair to say that that goal is a long way off. It was a goal of the Trump administration. It is something that Kim Jong-un had agreed to in summits with President Trump, but then at the working level, nothing happened. Now, my hope is that if President Trump had been reelected, progress would have been made towards that goal. I don't know if that would have been achieved. I think that should be our ultimate goal, but whether there's anyone in this town who believes that will actually be achieved, I'd have to say there probably are very few.
Ambassador Jeffrey, is the Biden administration trying to just manage the North Korea problem or try to solve it? Is the Biden administration just kicking the can down the road?
That's a very good question. And if you were posing the question in my primary area of expertise, the Middle East, I would be giving you the same answer. The Biden administration is clearly aggressively and ruthlessly prioritizing the threats. that is China and Russia. Threats from Iran, threats from international terrorism, threats from North Korea are at a second level. Now, there's two problems with this. First is we can have an accident or a mistake, and particularly with North Korea, that is the case, but also with Iran and its nuclear program. But secondly, the Biden administration does understand, and they're right, that insecurity and instability in any area, in fact, that's stated in the National Security Strategy from last year, affects the overall collective security system everywhere in the world. We're helping defend Ukraine by defending South Korea and the reverse. And everybody has to understand that and make sure that that is a part of our strategy, which is why that we're doing things like the Wendy Sherman meeting with the two deputy foreign ministers. So they're not neglecting it, but it definitely is not as high a priority as China or Russia.
You talk about insecurity somewhere would lead to insecurity everywhere. And the Biden administration is actually strengthening extended deterrence and defense posture around the Korean Peninsula. Whereas President Trump canceled military exercises, and for 4 years, the defense posture were weakened.
This is a very important point. In some areas, actually, the Trump administration built up military forces, particularly vis-a-vis China and in Eastern Europe. But nonetheless, you're right. But there's a problem with that because we're seeing the same thing in the Middle East, where our Central Command is maintaining a very strong forward presence in the region. But military power and deployment and presence alone, without an overall strategic diplomatic approach and strategy, is not enough to keep a region from descending into chaos, or at least the risk of it descending. And that's my problem. We need diplomacy with North Korea, as Frederick said, just like we need diplomacy in the Middle East to reinforce the military presence. That alone is not going to do it.
Well, I think that this administration is making the same mistake that the Obama administration made. It had a policy called strategic patience for North Korea, which basically ignored the threat, and the missile and nuclear threat grew enormously during the Obama administration. And I think Ambassador Jeffrey is right. This is a matter of priorities. This administration's priorities are China, Russia, and reviving the terrible 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. The U.S. is a global power. It has to be able to focus on multiple threats. Given that North Korea tested over 75 missiles last year, it may be preparing a seventh underground nuclear threat. This is a very serious threat to global security, and I really regret very much that it was not even mentioned in President Biden's State of the Union address, and that's something my organization is trying to bring to the White House's attention.
So in the face of North Korea's 75 missile tests, United States and South Korea strengthened extended deterrence and strengthened its defense posture. It has never been this strong when it comes to discussions on extended deterrence before.
I don't think that's really going to answer the threat here. We haven't had a serious interest in engaging North Korea.
Are you saying the current state of extended deterrence is not strong enough?
I'm saying that's not addressing the threat from North Korea's missile and nuclear programs. There's not a serious program to engage North Korea. And I think the best example of that is the recent national security strategy that barely mentioned North Korea. This administration doesn't have a plan for North Korea because it is distracted by other disputes around the world. And I think that it would be better if we had a full-time special envoy and a much more developed plan on how to deal with North Korea, denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, and try to normalize relations with the North.
So, Ambassador Jeffrey, is there a reason that South Koreans should be now concerned about U.S. extended deterrence to South Korea then?
First of all, the U.S. commitment to defend South Korea against North Korea is firm and solid, and our military leadership, Secretary Austin, General Milley, have reinforced that recently. Nonetheless, I agree with Mr. Fleitz that you can't just have military steps, which are fairly easy, more frequent flights of bombers, different kinds of weapon systems. You have to have a diplomatic strategy of which the military is only one component. But more importantly, even on the military side, North Korea is moving towards the ability to overwhelm American defenses and strike America with nuclear-tipped ICBMs. We don't know how many years out that is, but that is a game changer. We saw that with the Soviets in Europe in the 1950s and then 1960s, and we had to take very significant steps, including, in the case of France, developing its own nuclear weapons capability. So these enhanced deterrence military measures, they're better and they're more integrated, particularly with Japan and South Korea, than we've seen before, but they don't really answer even the military threat over the horizon, and they certainly don't provide a substitute for real diplomacy. Again, I agree with Mr. Fleitz.
So, on the military side, is there a plus alpha needed on top of the current extended deterrence system, and what would that plus alpha be?
The plus could be, there is one of three ways to do this. One is to station American tactical nuclear weapons, again in Korea, because they were pulled out in the 1990s. We are doing that in Europe today. Secondly, joint control of nuclear weapons. We do that with a number of NATO states. I can't name them because it's classified, but everybody knows that we do it, where they fly the airplanes, we provide the weapons. Or thirdly, South Korea takes the decision, as France under de Gaulle did, that it will develop its own nuclear capabilities. And of course, the current South Korean president has at least hinted at that. So those are the really big military muscle movements. But again, they can't be taken in isolation from a diplomatic strategy integrated between Seoul and Washington to deal with the underlying issue of North Korea as a state and as a threat to the whole region.
So are you saying there is a rationale in 87% of South Korean population wanting a nuclear weapon, whether it be their own or whether it be the U.S. weapon, on their soil?
That's a very good question, and I'll duck a specific answer to it. First of all, we should listen to the population of our partner countries. They have an important voice, particularly in a democratic system. But more importantly, the South Korean people are showing that they're thinking about the big issues. It's not just more B-2 bombers flying over South Korean airspace every month rather than every 2 months, which is essentially what we're doing to do enhanced military deterrence. It is these big questions. I don't have an answer to it, but it is important to start thinking about this, because the ability to strike the United States with nuclear weapons has been a game changer in our strategy towards Europe 50 years ago. It will be a game changer in our relationship with South Korea as well.
Mr. Fleitz, President Trump in 2016, when he was the Republican presidential frontrunner, indicated that he might support Japan and South Korea developing their own nuclear weapons rather than relying solely on the U.S. He said, at some point, we cannot be the policeman of the world, and unfortunately, we have a nuclear world now. Will President Trump support South Korea and Japan's nuclear armament if he takes office again?
Well, I think if Mr. Trump took office, or any other Republican president, will strongly stand with South Korea and Japan. It is not the first choice of the United States, even under a new Trump administration, for either nation to develop nuclear weapons. But that is a threat that I think would be pushed if North Korea's nuclear program continues to advance. And I think President Trump, a second administration, would try to respond by engaging China. There hasn't been enough pressure on China to enforce UN sanctions, to pressure North Korea to stop its missile and nuclear program. That's a key part of this whole problem that we haven't been seeing over the past 2 years.
Now, we were talking about what other options we have other than just extended deterrence. And Kim Jong-un fears the K-drama and the K-pop influencing the North Korean people. In this case, would information campaign be the most effective way to change the North Korean system and the nature of the North Korean regime? In 2017, DNI James Clapper said, "What does bother me a bit is that we don't capitalize on our great weapon, which is information." Mr. Clapper said the regime went nuts over loudspeaker broadcasts across the DMZ.
I think DNI Clapper is right. Knowledge of the outside world is something that the Kim regime and family really fear. They don't want their people to know the deprivation, the lack of freedom that the people have. The people do know. They are learning what's going on in the outside world. And I think information is a very powerful weapon to counter this regime. And I believe there's many people in South Korea who understand that.
Now, Ambassador Jeffrey, Kim Jong-un is a third-generation hereditary leader. CIA Fact Book says North Korea is one of the most isolated countries in the world and the poorest country in Asia. When dealing with such a country, isn't it only prudent that United States makes countermeasures against a possible coup or a regime collapse?
It is, first of all. Second, trust me, in the bowels of the U.S. government, people have plans that they update all of the time because that's how the U.S. government works. But we have to be careful here. The United States spent 30 years thinking that, and again, it gets back to Mr. Clapper's comment about information, or if you will, soft power, that soft power is going to do the job that military force won't do and eventually erase all of our international problems, be it the Iranian mullahs, be it the North Korean, as you said, list of leaders and 3 generations now. It's possible, it's not likely, and it's not something that we can base our policy and our assumptions on. If it happens, good, be ready to take advantage of it, but don't assume it's going to work because it seldom has.
Wendy Sherman, in 2016 at a forum in CSIS, it is increasingly necessary for all of the key players, the US, China, Korea, Japan, to discuss scenarios involving regime collapse or coup in North Korea. She said we should seriously think about this. What is your take?
We do seriously think about it. The point is, that can't be the center of our policy, because the next step is then we try to encourage that. And the next step after that is we get ahead of, as we say, our headlights. We are starting to do things that we're not willing to bear the consequences of. And most importantly, we have to listen to first South Korea, and we have to listen also to Japan and the rest of our Asian allies when we go down that road. I would say that it's something to think about, but it's not at the same level as the other things we've discussed here today.
Now, Mr. Fleitz, at the 75th founding anniversary of North Korea's army, North Korea showcased a suspected solid-fueled ICBM. Now, North Korea has a pattern of first testing its engine and then parading it at the military parade and then do a full-fledged large-scale testings. Should we anticipate North Korea doing large-scale solid-fuel ICBM testings in the near future?
This parade was very provocative and also showed Hwasong 17 ICBMs with a range of 15,000 kilometers. And to understand how far that is, New York City is 11,000 kilometers from Seoul. So these missiles could hit the east coast of the United States. My guess is that a solid-fueled ICBM could hit at least that far. And the danger of these is that they are easy to hide because liquid fuel weapons have to be fueled just before launch, and they're very fragile and dangerous. These could be hidden, fired very quickly. We don't know these missiles were actually in this parade. We know there were canisters. We don't know what was in the canisters. The canisters suggest what these missiles are. There is some information that the North Koreans have been testing this. I think there will be solid fuel missile tests. But one thing we're seeing with the North Korean missile program, they are jumping ahead leaps and bounds that seem to go beyond their testing. And I believe, and there's a number of rocket experts believe, that North Korea is getting a significant amount of outside assistance, maybe from Russian or Ukrainian rocket scientists that have helped them get over. You may remember 5 or 6 years ago, there were a large number of missile failures, but we've seen since 2017 a long record of successful long-range missile tests that seem to go beyond the static on-the-ground missile tests. So something has changed here, and it wouldn't surprise me if we suddenly see a solid fuel ICBM tested, even though there may not have been a significant amount of static rocket engine tests.
You just talked about cooperation on missile development. Do you think there is also cooperation, outside help on nuclear development of North Korea, especially cooperation with Iran?
I believe sometime that there's a strong possibility of that. We know that the North Korean and Iranian nuclear programs both benefited from A.Q. Khan, the father of the Pakistani nuclear weapon. We know both programs are cooperating in missile technology. There have been reports of Iranian scientists witnessing North Korean nuclear tests. Whether there's any solid information of that, I haven't seen it, but I think there's a strong possibility that there's been some cooperation, maybe one state doing cold tests on behalf of the other. But certainly these two adversaries of the U.S. have a lot of common goals, and it wouldn't surprise me if they're cooperating.
Well, that's all the time we have for today. Mr. Fleitz, Ambassador Jeffrey, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us on.
Good to be here.
And thank you for watching. We'll be back here next week with U.S. experts to discuss the two Koreas and the region right here from Washington.